Alright, in this video I wanted to talk a little bit about the Ethereum platform, which we touched on in the previous recording. And I keep calling these videos, but they really aren't. Alright, so basically the Ethereum platform, as I mentioned, is a world computer. It's a little bit silly to call that. It's a distributed computer in the sense that basically any computation that's run on it is run by everyone. And this allows computations to be secured, right? So when we say that, for example, Joe voted for Bob, if I say that, I assert that, that statement is checked by everyone on the Ethereum network, and that allows there to be certainty that in fact that is true, that that was the result of, let's say, Joe's decision to hit the vote button next to Bob's name. I don't know, maybe I got those two mixed up, but that's the basic idea, is to take computation to secure it by distributing it across many nodes, and to thus allow for sort of determinism in the way that computations happen, to make sure that in fact, yes, that was the result of that operation. And this allows for a lot of very interesting this very abstract, very generic kind of idea of smart contracts, of distributed computing, and cryptographic security of computing. It allows for a lot of very interesting applications. But there are a lot of limitations. I'm going to talk about a few of the applications. Distributed organizations, classic example. So something like government voting, so allowing for you to vote for different constituents, representatives, this kind of thing. Things like voting in an organization, a board of members that can vote on various policies, vote yay or nay or whatever, and to make sure that however far apart those people may be, whatever kind of economies or governments might be constricting their ability to move around, that this world computer will allow them to still operate as a part of this organization. And you might say, well, that's a bit silly, right? I mean, why would we really care? When you've got a board of 12 people, they can just Skype each other, and yes, it's not perfectly secure. Maybe there is someone holding a gun to their head, but that wouldn't really help us in the case of the blockchain. Like, practically speaking, what is the gain here? And the real gain here is scale. When you talk about, yes, 12 people in an organization, it seems a little bit silly, but what about 1,000, 2,000, 100,000 organization members? And now you get to see kind of the parallel to voting in the US, for example, where you've got 350 million people. Yes, not all of them are, eligible to vote, but I would say the vast majority are. And this means effectively that, you've got millions, hundreds of millions of votes pouring in that you have to sort through, and it becomes a very difficult task. So having a decentralized organization of, again, thousands or hundreds of thousands of members, that can be a real task, not something you want to do by Skype, and so the Ethereum platform can allow you to effectively do that. But these are just, very simple, very typical examples. You can talk about much more complicated things. When you talk about computation like this, you could do things like gambling, right? You could make sure that the casino never cheats, that the house never cheats. And this is one of the most important applications of this kind of computation, is that it's totally available to everyone to see exactly what the code is that's going to be run is. So, you're not dealing with the kind of the black box that we're so used to. When you open up a computer, the vast majority, and especially the important code running on the computer is proprietary, totally hidden to you. All you can see is binaries, and yes, you could reverse engineer those binaries, and yes, you can gain some sort of insight into how they work just by observing them, but the basic functionality is totally hidden. Now, when you talk about, decentralized computation, all of the code, everything that it declares that it will do, totally available. And this is a really powerful idea. This idea of having, it's not just open source, it's really open computation. This idea of code that runs and is totally transparent about what it's trying to do, how it's going to work, So something like a casino becomes very, very enticing, right? How do we know? Even the most prestigious, casino that's been, supposedly vetted by, some of the best players in the world, how do we know that um, they're actually being truthful about it? How the payouts work, how the cards are dealt, this kind of thing. And yes, you can call for audits. Yes, you can call for some of these things, but in a sense, we get audits for free. We get just total transparency, and that's a very, very powerful thing, right? The code is just out there, um, and that's very powerful. Now, you can still do things to kind of complicate the code in such a way that it's unclear how something works. Classic example of tax code being so complicated that even though everyone has you know theoretically anyone can get a copy of the U.S. tax code, uh, that doesn't mean that they can understand it, right? So there are still limitations, but some of these ideas are very powerful and really help the Ethereum blockchain be a very powerful platform for computation. There are crazy applications, and in a sense the world's the limit, right? I mean, you can do insane things. There was a great example, a really popular example of an application on the Ethereum blockchain called CryptoKitties. And it was basically a sort of pet collection. I don't know if it was sort of like Pokemon or um, what the idea was, but the basic idea is that you could create these cats, or you could get these cats by some sort of mechanism. You could breed them. Your breeding took time. Depending on who you breeded them with, then you could get different cats, you could collect the cats, you could trade the cats. It was a really, really powerful sort of marketplace, and almost like a CryptoKitties world built on the platform that, seemed a lot more interesting than just like decentralized voting, right? So there are a lot of interesting applications, and honestly the limits are, engineers' abilities to really write code. Some of this code is very hard to build, and there are lots of challenges to writing it effectively. Um, a lot of the economic incentives are a little bit warped, and that's what I'm going to get into. So, what are the limitations of the Ethereum blockchain? It might seem like, oh my god, the sky's the limit, this is amazing, a world computer, think of the possibilities. The possibilities aren't that great, actually. So, the basic trouble with this is, like I said, everyone has to run all the code. Which seems like a great idea when you talk about the sort of security that you get, but just like Bitcoin, Ethereum is basically handling this like it's attacked, it's under attack all the time. It's this sort of constant auditing which gets ridiculous, and it's expensive, right? Computation is expensive, it costs time, money, this kind of thing. And so the incentives, or the disincentives, have to exist to discourage just continuous computation. And this means that basically it's this crazy kind of idea, but users have to pay to use the applications. Unless there's some crazy sort of setup to where, like in the case of CryptoKitties, they're making a lot of money so they can cover the costs of these computations. There have to be, at the very least, severe limits on how the users can use the application, and, really at worst, costs to the user. To balance, basically the computation with the costs that the network imposes on that computation. So, what you deal with is something in the case of CryptoKitties where you really have to rethink totally how computation happens, because computation cannot happen unless it really, 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 really needs to. And this means that a lot of applications are either very difficult to write, or can only be partially written, or simply cannot be written on the Ethereum blockchain, just because of how their computations would need to work. Anything that is computationally intensive basically is a no-go, right? Because it's so expensive that it would really have to generate a tremendous amount of money. The incentives for using this application would be such that it would be able to balance these costs, because most things won't. Again, you have to think about it in terms of anything that you're doing, you're duplicating across all the nodes on the network, which is something that just doesn't exist in traditional computer programming. That's not something we have to deal with. So it's a kind of a whole different paradigm, and it does impose some very severe restrictions. The other thing that's troublesome is that every computation has to be deterministic, right? Everyone has to be able to agree on the input. Yes, and then also on the output. The trouble with that is that in fact, the only interesting, it has to be deterministic, and beyond that, it can't have side effects, right? And in a sense, the only interesting computations are the ones that have side effects, the ones that display to your monitor, that post a score to a website. You can't do any of that on Ethereum. Now, you can still affect the underlying contracts, so they have side effects in that sense. But, when you talk about something as simple as, I would like to have an application that displays hello world on their screen, that's impossible. Now, what you can do is you can build pipelines from the Ethereum blockchain to essentially observe the Ethereum blockchain. So you can say, okay, I'm going to have a contract that's going to have some sort of message in it, and that message can be observed from the outside. And that's possible. And there are certain pipelines into that blockchain and into the data of the contracts that would allow you to, indirectly display hello world to the screen. The other thing that's sort of difficult is kind of the other way around. So, here we have difficulty in actually doing anything to the world. And on the flip side, you have trouble actually getting information from the world. The basic idea of, how do you do like a casino with random numbers? That requires a sort of an input from the outside world, whether it's a timestamp to seed the computation or something like that. And this becomes very tricky, right? And there are certain sort of, you don't want to call them hacks, but there are certain workarounds to sort of build pipes into the Ethereum blockchain, but they're quite limited. So we have these limitations. We have these definite limitations of the kind of computations that can happen on this platform. And it really raises concerns about, well, what can it really be used for? And it's true, there are some interesting, toy applications, and there are even applications that are more interesting. But, I think beyond the kind of direct, the direct real-world translation of, these blockchain transactions, or rather, these blockchain contracts to real-world contracts, things like voting, a voting contract that says that if a constituent gets X votes, then they are elected, this kind of thing. Besides those translations to the real world, the effectiveness of the Ethereum blockchain is pretty suspect. And again, it's very new, hasn't been around for very long, hasn't been stable for very long, right? I think we're just starting to see kind of stable versions of the blockchain platform. So, it is reasonable to say let's wait a little while before we declare that this is not going to be broadly useful. And I think there are a lot of kind of important applications, like we talked about voting and decentralized organizations. But in terms of its broad appeal and its broad effectiveness, it is definitely questionable. And again, it's very easy to kind of jump on the bandwagon and say, oh my god, this is going to change the world, this is like the internet 3.0 or whatever. But I don't know really. I think at a basic level, and it's worth kind of talking about this because I think Ethereum's a great example, there is this kind of basic divide between crypto and fiat and the rest of the world. It's not really fair to call it fiat, but it's the debate, or it's the argument between centralization and decentralization. And these things are not replacements for each other. It's not like centralization is just a better decentralization, or decentralization is a better centralization, right? They're very different. They operate on two different ends of a spectrum. And you can have things that are very centralized and things that are very decentralized and things that are somewhere in the middle. And I think there are different ways in which both sides are useful, and going all the way in one direction or all the way in the other direction, it's yet to be shown that this is actually an effective thing to do, to be totally decentralized. It still appears, and time will tell perhaps which side of history is kind of the winner, I guess, but it still appears there are a lot of good reasons, at least in our current society, to value centralization, to value the Visa payment network over the blockchain, Bitcoin payment network, to value, a server that, Google servers that compute things on their own and without you understanding what they're doing, as opposed to some sort of decentralized Google. Um, there are advantages on the decentralized side, but they're pretty specific, and to kind of wholesale throw out centralization for decentralization seems to be definitely a questionable position. Now, some of the most interesting sort of parts of blockchain technology are somewhere in the middle, right? They're somewhere between centralization and decentralization. But, I think it's also important to recognize where there is value in kind of the purity of decentralization. A lot of these, more centralized versions, something like Ripple or something like Bitcoin Cash, that have this kind of implied centralization. Although they're kind of put forward as these kind of perfect compromises and the best of both worlds and this kind of thing, I think in a sense they're just a sort of Visa 2.0. And so the kind of the hype surrounding them is questionable in the sense that it's basically just the future of payment networks, a future that's already here in a sense that we already have a lot of very modern payment networks that work very efficiently and very effectively and quite securely. So the need for more currencies and more kind of um, even more complicated systems that are some sort of blend of the two seems questionable in the sense that, Visa is already very powerful. Things like Apple Pay, Android Pay, very, very powerful, very effective, already in use, already tried and true in that sense. So, that's where the kind of the combination of the two, the sort of the best of both worlds, is also questionable. I hope that this doesn't seem like I'm trying to sort of get down on crypto and on blockchain technology. I think it's a very, very interesting technology. I think it's a great idea to invest in this technology, from a technology perspective. What I don't think makes sense is to kind of, think about it from a technology perspective and then somehow, transition that into, oh well, this is now the best thing. This is what everyone should be using, and we're just waiting until, total adoption is here. It's a little bit silly. It's not really founded in any kind of reasonable argument to say that this is somehow so much better or what. There are some very real questions that need to be answered before these things are used widely. And that's what I think should be stressed. We need to focus on the technology, on improving the technology, before we try and sort of broadly encourage mass adoption. This should not be a kind of I don't think we're ready to take this stand of everyone should be using this, because it's just not ready. I think in the future we'll see a lot of improvements to the underlying blockchain technology. There are already kind of motions that are taking place to kind of push blockchain technology in a way away from the kind of the constant attack, the world is on fire all the time, to a kind of a more something that looks for problems not all the time but only sometimes, and that's more effective as a payment network. And I think that could be where the real future is for users. If we can create the next generation of payment networks, I think there's a real use for that. And so I wanted to end this, because this is going to be the end of the two-part series, with some of the sort of proposals, some of the things that we could do with crypto that we could never do with Visa or Apple Pay or any of these kind of modern payment networks. One of the first things that's super interesting is this idea of streaming money. So there's an idea that's existed since time immemorial of the trade. This idea that I have to establish with you some contract, and we have to agree on the terms, and we have to put, if we want to be very secure about it, some sort of escrow together to ensure that the trade only happens on the right foot, and if not, something goes wrong, then it can be reverted, and this kind of thing. It's a very, very complicated sort of setup that has to happen. There's no good way to ensure that it happens correctly. It's very complicated, very difficult, right, to actually achieve. Trading is hard. And one of the most classic examples of trading is just paying someone for some labor. They have to work, then you have to pay them, and there's this whole back and forth of how long do I work before you pay me? Do you pay some portion of it now before I start working, or do I start working before you pay me? Or there's this kind of whole back and forth, and it's the most broadly sort of, it's the broadest example of a trade. It's just, paying you for labor. I give you some labor, you pay me. It's something that happens all the time, every moment. It is, from an economic perspective, where money gets its value is the labor that it can buy. So if there was some way, instead of having to pay all at once, if there was some way to stream money, to say that as you are working, you are getting paid, and as soon as you stop getting paid. That's the that's the most economically sensible way of doing it, right? Every hour, every minute, every second of work has value that you do. And so it makes sense that as you're working, you should be getting that value for doing that work. And so if you stop halfway through the day, that doesn't mean that you don't get any money, right? You've already gotten what half a day's work is. Now there are questions about kind of splitting these things up, and does it really make sense? Does every second actually have a certain dollar value associated with it? Maybe not. But the idea of streaming money is a very interesting one. It would definitely be kind of a great example of really the power of a payment network, because it would be something that would be totally beyond something like Visa or Apple Pay. Another thing that's very interesting to think about is using sort of blockchain to allow for, and I guess this is kind of in the same vein, but to allow for payment networks that kind of work together in a way. And there are already versions of something like this, but to break down the barriers to actually trading, markets are expensive. Building markets it's a very complicated thing, and if there was some way to use these kind of payment networks to create decentralized exchanges, it would really, really help, because the centralized exchanges are complicated, they're costly to build, they're costly to maintain, they can malfunction. If you could create decentralized, widely available decentralized exchanges, say between Bitcoin and Ether, that would be a very powerful thing. It would really help participation in markets. It would really help allow people to really realize the full economic potential of whatever things they have. If I have wood, in a sense, or if I have labor, going back to the first example, in a sense the value of that labor is in some sense tied to what kind of markets I can participate in. And when you talk about centralized markets where you have to work through this organization, through these you have to follow these set criteria, that's complicated. Whereas if you could create a huge sort of decentralized network that will allow you to trade your labor with anyone who's looking for your labor, to match you automatically, that would be a very, very effective way of kind of bringing, markets to the 21st century. So those two things, fully decentralized networks, or markets rather, and streaming streaming payments, that would be kind of the pinnacle, I feel like, of at least the modern blockchain cryptocurrencies or payment networks. In terms of Ethereum, I think really the sky's the limit. Like I'm not sure where exactly you could take it. I think there are lots of possibilities, and if computations could be less expensive, if you could have kind of side chain sort of computations that could affect the world and kind of receive some sort of input from the world more effectively, I think that would also be very powerful. If you can kind of flesh out what is now the kind of the raw, secure core of the Ethereum blockchain, that could be very powerful. And who's telling what could be built with that? So I hope you enjoyed this, probably just a two-part series on Ethereum and Bitcoin and, well, some other cryptocurrencies, unnamed, but, just a sort of discussion of the current state of crypto and what it can do, what it can't do, where it's powerful, where it's weak. And hopefully you enjoyed this sort of fresh take, that's not trying to sell you on anything, it's not trying to tell you how amazing something is or how terrible something is, just trying to take a sort of balanced perspective. Now, this is not by any means the only perspective, and this is not expert advice. There are people out there that know much more about this than I do, But I just wanted to give you kind of a layman's perspective on this, and you know, try to think about this more in terms of what these things can actually do, as opposed to just, you know, what the name means, or what kind of speculation surrounds it. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching, or rather listening.